Hey internets, so here we are in the year 2024. These days, anyone with access to the internet alongside a half-decent PC can pretty much find extremely detailed and often academic level information on any subject you want. For example, you can search YouTube for math tutorials and find people who give even better explanations than top university professors. Just as early as 25 years ago, this sort of thing was just completely unheard of. The resources available at your fingertips through the internet are so vast, they may as well be infinite. Or another way to put it is that mankind has effectively invented the Akashic Records. Okay, maybe not quite that extreme, but you get the idea. If you know how to use the internet properly, and something can be broken down to information, you can probably find it. This means that anyone who knows what they are doing and is at least intelligent enough to find said information and teach themselves using the plethora of resources out there, also known as autodidaction, can potentially learn just about as much, if not more, on a topic than someone who has graduated with said topic as their major. And as the cherry on top, this type of self-education can all be done practically for free. And yet, despite this fact, something really weird is going on within the academic and journo-fueled cathedral these days. It seems now more than ever we are experiencing the problem of credential worship, or this really bizarre idea that you can't possibly know anything unless you have a shiny piece of paper that says that you do. Never mind the fact that it's more possible than ever these days for an autodidact to be far more well-read than a credentialed expert trademark. So in this video, I will be explaining why this credential worship is basically just midwit cope. For starters, credentials in a field aren't actually worth as much as all the snobs would like you to believe. Credentialism often comes with the idea that in order to properly interpret primary source data, one needs to be an expert trademark in the field, or else their interpretation is likely to be wrong. But we know for a fact that this is not really true. The first problem is that the ability of credentialed experts is being grossly over-exaggerated by these people. One paper, Beyond Psychology, looked at the prevalence of p-value and confidence interval misinterpretation across multiple fields of expertise. And what they found was that errors in interpreting pretty basic statistics was extremely common, and it concluded that significantly better training is needed for people entering fields of scientific research, unless we want bogus papers to keep getting published. This is strange, because learning how to read statistics in academic papers is not actually that difficult. It's not some kind of voodoo magic that you need to study for 4 years in order to really get. Once you get over adopting that non-colloquial lexicon that research papers tend to use, which isn't really that hard at all since you can again just search the internet for any word or concept you aren't familiar with, all that's really left after that is learning how to understand things like p-values, effect sizes, and what control groups are for, so that you too can now enjoy finding out just how much supposedly peer-reviewed soft science research out there controlled for absolutely nothing. Literally nothing. Another issue is that the majority of experts in any given field are not actually that much better at predicting world affairs in regards to their own field of study than random people. The biggest example of this happening is mainstream economics, and our genius economists, whose inability to use their own models to predict even the simplest thing is pretty well documented. Failing to accurately predict stock market status, what it will be in a year, 2 years, or even just a week, recessions, interest, and inflation rates, time and time again, they regularly fail to predict it all. The modern mainstream economist might as well be looking into a crystal ball while using energy grids to channel the ghost of John Keynes, hence why they might as well be called economicists instead. Social scientists and psychologists don't fare much better. For instance, a paper on how they predicted how people react and how society would change during the pandemic proved that most of them are just, well, stabbing in the dark, and made various claims and predictions that didn't really do much better than whatever your Aunt Sophia posted on Facebook. And of course, the worst of all would be government ineptitude. Government agencies and politicians regularly fail to get anything right, to the point where you would be within reason to suspect that they are intentionally not telling the truth. Not just the elected officials, but entire bodies of three-letter agencies and their massive teams of overpaid experts who exist for the sole purpose of telling us things that later turn out to be completely untrue. A simple study from the Cato Institute shows how the government also failed us during the pandemic. So then, who can make good predictions and understand what's going on? The answer is foxes. Not literal foxes, of course, but foxes from the study in the book Expert Political Judgment from Tetlock, which made a distinction between fox-style understanding and hedgehog-style. The fox tends to know a little about a lot of different things, while the hedgehog tends to know a lot about very few, or sometimes just one thing. The study showed that foxes are better at telling which direction the world is going than hedgehogs, and have more accurate prediction power by about 35%. This same study also showed that the difference between regular people and those with credentials isn't anywhere near as far apart in this type of of understanding as we are told to believe. Now, experts do tend to do better. That's one important thing to point out. It's not that credentials are totally useless. They are useful. They do show that someone put forth some kind of effort in order to learn a certain topic, just that the gap in being able to reason these things out between them and someone who hasn't isn't anywhere near as big as the credentialists would like you to believe. Or in simpler words, being a jack of all trades instead of a master of one unironically gives one the ability to make better takes on world affairs and what's going on. And guess who tends to be fantastic jacks of all trades? That's right, autodidacts. The people who are self-motivated enough to teach themselves. And this is where the major flaw of credentialism in our modern times really starts to show itself. The self-motivation and ability to focus that is needed to be a good autodidact is very highly correlated with high IQ, or G factor. This has been proven time and time again, with one particular study from Miguel Kazan revealing the gap in this ability in children aged 6 to 11 to be pretty massive, honestly. And yet, strangely, the people who make credentialist arguments almost never talk about self-motivation or autodidaction, and they definitely often almost never are going to be talking about IQ, which is weird. That makes very little sense, as IQ itself is a pretty good base predictor of a person's success, regardless of their socioeconomic status. You can take a random teenager who is at least +1 standard deviation above average G, give them a mid-range laptop provided with a stable internet connection, ask them a question, just about any question really, and they will have an answer for you in minutes. Take another one who is at least +2 standard deviations above average, give them the same thing, and they can potentially teach themselves just about any subject faster than their own teachers can teach them in school. And yet, we just kind of don't take this reality into account. For whatever reason, people don't want to seem to acknowledge just how much this matters in what may very well be the golden age of the autodidact. What credentialists tend to do instead is that they compare people with credentials to the average Joe. The average Joe doesn't know X, the average person with credentials in X knows X, therefore you need credentials. But this is a fallacy, because autodidacts aren't necessarily average Joes in any given topic. An autodidact is someone who is, again, self-motivated to learn. And because of modern technology, if you are motivated to learn something, even if you yourself aren't a genius, you can use the resources of the internet to learn it. And so to completely dismiss a person's take just because they don't have credentials in a certain topic, or a certain field that they happen to be talking about, is actually just a combination of false comparison and false dichotomy. Knowing the difference between an average know-nothing and an average credentialed individual doesn't really tell you about the difference between them and the autodidact and whatever they've taught themselves. It's not just a gray area, it's a completely different third option on its own, and so the comparison just doesn't even make sense. So in other words, credentialists will point to the average Joe and then point to the difference between them and an expert trademark, and then point to the autodidact and assume that the same difference exists between the autodidact and the expert. Yeah, sorry, no, not valid reasoning. And this is where things are a little bit sad. We really haven't done enough studies on autodidaction and the age of the internet yet. There's a little bit of research that has been done on just how much a person can learn from online resources, but not nearly as much as you'd think. The so-called intellectual institutions are kind of lagging behind on this one. But then again, if you look at where credentialism often comes from, this isn't really that big of a surprise. Maybe it's just me, but I can't help but notice the fact that most of the people defending credentialism are usually some kind of cathedralite in some way. It's usually some self-professed scholar or some journo who is trying to defend their bad take by pointing to their credentials. Like a self-targeted version of the appeal to authority fallacy, where their bad take is magically a good take because shiny piece of paper say so. When the truth is that the gap between those who have traditional education and those who do not has simply been shrunk by modern technology to the point where saying credentials is just no longer a valid argument, if it ever even was a valid argument. It's now nothing more than just a form of anti-intellectualism where someone is refusing to look at a compilation of work on some topic because the person who did the research and did that compilation doesn't also have a shiny piece of paper, which again is dumb because foxy autodidacts can often spot patterns that require an understanding across multiple fields of study to catch. But perhaps the saddest part about credential worship is that people will start to confuse the credential for competency itself. For instance, people who think that lowering graduation requirements is somehow a good idea. For instance, when Oregon decided that students no longer need to prove that they have mastery of math and reading because that requirement was disproportionately harming students of color. So now they can get their diploma without needing to know any of that. Hooray! Except that doesn't actually help them. Having the piece of paper without having the skills associated with it isn't gonna give them any skills, and it's not gonna make people want to hire them anymore. Maybe in the short run, but certainly not in the long run when people catch on, because what's gonna happen is people are going to realize that this piece of paper no longer represents the competency that it once represented, and thus logically the value of said shiny piece of paper by doing this just ends up going down, something that we're already starting to see happen in certain job markets. us. So in conclusion, we need to recognize the reality that shiny credentials are not the end-all be-all, and embrace alternative forms of gaining skill, because if we don't, the economy will eventually recognize these facts for us, whether you like it or not. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, share, subscribe, or tip me on Ko-Fi, or just leave a comment or share the video somewhere for the algorithm. Till next time.